Oh, welcome to our channel, Aportes Afro-Costarricenses y Diaspóricos. This morning, I have the honor to have as a repeat guest on our channel, Dr. Natasha Gordon Chipembere. And this morning, she's going to share something wonderful with us in terms of the women that went before us. Natasha?
Good morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Hutchinson Miller, for allowing me back to this space. It's such an important one, and I'm really honored to be here and to share the legacy of my great-grandmother, Ruth Gourzong. Allow me to share my screen. And so I call this talk Carving Spaces in Between, the life of Ruth Gourzong in the 20th century, Puerto, Limon, Costa Rica. So in order to think about the intersections of history and generations, and to think about all the things that our ancestors do, particularly incredibly strong matriarchs, we locate sort of our present in order to follow the philosophy of Sankofa. And Sankofa is the West African concept of going and looking into your past in order to understand your present and then visualize your future. But if you don't know your past and your roots, you cannot envision or dream about your future. And so I start with myself. And here are some pictures of my family. You can see that on the left, there's a picture of my mother, Norma Gordon de Robotham, that's her family name, and my daughter, Aminata, when she was much younger, and myself. And then the picture on the right is the most recent one. My daughter's all grown up, you can see her, and that's my son at his high school graduation, along with my husband, Masauko Chipembere. And so just as a little bit of context, I am a professor of African and African diasporic literature. I've been teaching from South Africa to New York to now in Costa Rica for over 20 years. And I do the work specifically around sort of amplifying the voices of enslaved people. Right. And so I'm specifically looking and doing that work and thinking about Afro-Costa Ricans who were enslaved and who were free during the colonial period, and sort of what that grounding and their legacy means in Costa Rica. I was born in New York to a Costa Rican mother and a Panamanian father. And 7 years ago, my husband and I decided to move our children to Costa Rica full time. And so that is where I'm based. And in the process of coming back to Costa Rica, where I have a huge matrilineal family, meaning all my mother's family remains here in Costa Rica. We have about 4 generations right now living. One of the things that I began to do is gather information around our family's history, particularly around the matriarch of our family, Ruth Gourzong. I'm really fascinated by her story, her extraordinariness in the time period in which she was living as a Black woman from Jamaica, and thinking about the fact that I am 4th in her generation and my daughter is 5th. And so I am thinking about legacy. I think about documenting these stories and just having narratives and envisioning the world that she lived in, right? And so as a Black woman who was an immigrant in Costa Rica that in many cases was not necessarily as welcoming as many people believed. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I position myself as the 4th generation, mother to the 5th generation, but also looking back. This is my Sankofa moment, looking back and really honoring the power of Ruth Gourzong as the person who started my family's lineage here in Costa Rica. So who was Ruth Gourzong? Here's a picture of her. One of the things that we always talk about is that Ruth was a very elegant Jamaican woman, and she always wore her pearls. And so it's really interesting to sort of see this this Black woman who carried herself in a particular way, and the entire community recognized that. She was deeply respected, but she was also very elegant, right? And so there was a sense of apartness, a sense of regalness that she maintained, and certainly that has been passed down through the generations. So who was she? Let's talk a little bit about Ruth Gourzong. I just want to show you, here is her British passport, which is really interesting. She's a Jamaican, and she ended up obviously having a British passport because we understand that the British were they were the colonizers of Jamaica, and she was not a Costa Rican, even though after 1956, the process for naturalization could begin. She never became naturalized. She was always seen as a Jamaican and obviously a member of the British Commonwealth. And so here is her passport that we have with her signatures for August in 1955, which is extraordinary, right? If we're thinking about documents and legacy, she was someone who traveled widely because she lived in Puerto Limon, which was the port, but it was the entrance into the Atlantic world. And so she went to New York, she got on ships. How was that possible? Because she had wealth. And so we're going to talk about that, particularly as since she was a widow, what that meant. Here's another picture of her. What's interesting is this, that here we have her birthday. So she was born on May 10th, 1891 in Falmouth, Jamaica. And this is a picture of her inside in her later years. This is in 1955. And that's her signature. So we're really lucky to have these original documents still in our family. And this is a very famous picture of her. She was always well dressed. This is around 1940s in Puerto Limon on the street. Even though it was a very hot temperature, she always walked around with her hat, very well dressed, always had her umbrella with her as almost a walking stick. And she was definitely revered in the community. So we know that she was born on May 10th. As I said, in 1891 in Falmouth, Jamaica. And she married William Gourzong in Limon in April 1911. And so William Gourzong, who is my great-grandfather, what we know about him is that he was from New Orleans, and his mother was an African woman. We don't know of her status, whether she was freed or enslaved, but she was an African woman, and she was married to a French man in New Orleans, which made sense because at that time period, we're talking about the middle 19th century, we're talking about the French had that territory before the Louisiana Purchase. So it was very clear that the French were very much involved in that area. But one of the things that we knew is that William had been offered a job to run the northern quarters, or in Limon, they call it the Northern Hotel, which was an exclusive housing residence for people who worked on the railroad. So we have the Northern Railroad Company that was run by Minor Cooper Keith, who had a contract with Costa Rica, the Costa Rican government, to build the railroad from the port into the Central Valley, primarily first to bring the coffee from the Central Valley out to the port and into the Atlantic world, because what Costa Rica had been doing was they had been sending their coffee and their goods through the Pacific from Punta Arenas and going all the way down into South America and then coming around through the Atlantic to try to get to Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a losing situation because the goods couldn't be sustained. And so they ended up building this railroad, but William Gourzong was offered the position to run this quarters that was only going to be for the people of the company, and they were from the US, so they were English speaking, white Americans, and other sort of higher level Costa Rican Spanish speaking mestizos, right? And so one of the conditions, though, for him going to run this hotel or these quarters was that he had to have a family. And so what I come to find out is that he stopped in Falmouth, which was the major port city in Jamaica, because remember, Jamaica was the largest producer of sugar during slavery for the world. And so he stopped in Falmouth, Jamaica, which is where my great grandmother Ruth had been born. And so essentially they met up, and then eventually they decided to move as a young couple to Limon. And they had over the next 20 years 7 children together, which sort of is the foundation. So all 7 children were born in Limon. And my great grandmother's name, her full name was Ruth Grant Young de Gourzong, because she married into William Gourzong. So what's extraordinary about this is that William was a very respected man. And it's really interesting because the United Fruit Company, once the Northern Railroad was built and Henry Meigs joined with the folks from Boston to create the United Fruit Company, the United Fruit Company was the largest employers of both men and women on that Caribbean coast of Limon. And then we can talk about Guatemala and even Nicaragua in terms of the banana republics all along that coast through the United Fruit Company. But what was interesting is that most of the people who were employed were either laborers, right? So on the banana plantations, or building the railroad until it was completed, or in some sort of domestic servitude. What was interesting is that the Gourzongs did not engage in that. They came in as the sole managers for these quarters that was highly segregated, right? The only people who the local Afro-Caribbean, Black Caribbean people who were in the quarters were people who worked either in the kitchen or they worked in some sort of service, but around the quarters. They did not stay there. So it was really the folks who came overnight to sleep there. If they were on the railroad and changing to go back the next day, back up into San Jose, that is where they stayed. So it was a very elite, exclusive place. And also, whenever anyone came in from the ships from outside, that was where they stayed in the quarters. And there was a very distinguished and very huge dining room that was very exclusive for these people, and it was racially segregated. However, once William dies in 1937, his wife takes over for 20 years. So you have this Black woman who is the mother of 7 children and now obviously going to become a grandmother, right? As her children marry and establish their own homes. But for 20 years, you have this Black woman who runs this highly racially segregated quarters, but is incredibly respected. She gets paid in dollars. And she has her own office in the quarters, and she's given 2 private rooms for her family so that they can come and stay if they want. But she had her own office, and any of the men who had to have any dealings at all with the quarters and staying there and any kind of provisions had to come to her office, and she negotiated with them. Right. And it was really extraordinary in that time period where you have other Black women who are more in the labor service, where you have this particular woman negotiating with the heads of the United Fruit Company, right? Not only just providing their accommodations and their food, but she is also negotiating as almost a peer and very highly respected. She didn't speak any Spanish. This was a completely English-speaking world, and it was very much a world that was very insular to the Limon in which she had grown up. Eventually, she retires in 1956, and then her daughter, Beatrice, and her husband, Oscar McCrae, take over, as well as her daughter, Olive. So they take over the management of the northern quarters until finally it closed in 1963. So my great-grandparents, William and Ruth Gourzong, were the sole proprietors. They didn't own the quarters, but they ran it as the senior management. And it was extraordinary because she didn't marry again, so there was not another man with her to run this establishment. She was seen as a respected woman in her own right, and obviously savvy enough to run this establishment on her own, and was very, very respected.
Somos voces de la historia, sangre, tinta y papel. Somos voces de la historia, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber. Ao e ao, ao e ao.